Hello, I'm Claire Poole and welcome to the Climate of Sport podcast, the show in which you get the inside track on all things sport and sustainability globally. Join me every week where I'll be chatting to a special guest about news, opinion and insights on how sport is moving to a more environmentally friendly future or taking action on climate change. Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Climate of Sport podcast. I'm delighted this week to be joined by Seyi Smith, 2 times Olympian and founder of Racing to Zero. Seyi, welcome to the podcast. It's lovely to have you.
Good morning, Claire. Thanks for the invite. Happy to be here.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It is a pleasure. So for those who don't know you, I think it's a great point to kick off to hear a little background about you. So tell us about you, what you've been up to, not all the way from grade school, don't worry, just in your sporting background, and then your journey within sustainability as well.
Sure. I'll start with my sporting background, not too far back. As you said, I'm a 2-time Olympian in athletics and bobsleigh. Athletics was my main thing in life from, I'd say, 15 years to when I retired, just after my 30s. I competed for Canada and Olympics, World Champs, Commonwealth Games, the whole deal. And I kind of had worked my way up through the Canadian system in athletics from junior international competitions to the senior level, like I said. And it spanned from 2003 to 2016. Didn't make it to Rio. That was my last attempt to make my second games. I took some time off after that just to sort of work full time because I have a bachelor's in electrical engineering from Loughborough University, and I have a master's in renewable energy technologies or renewable energy systems technologies from Loughborough as well. And I'll talk about that shortly. But because of that professional background, I was able to find a job fairly, like a full-time job, very quickly, and just sort of went into it after my retirement. But I still had that itch sitting at a desk. It was fun, it was rewarding, and it was nice to sort of have consistent income. But seeing my old training partners jetting around, going to Dubai and London and Shanghai, and just living the athlete life while I was pushing deliverables, it made me want to come back. So my strength and conditioning coach, who happened to be the coach for the bobsled team in Canada, in the city I was living, said, "Hey, why don't you come out for some bobsled testing?" And I did, and it was a quick turnaround. My first trip down a bobsled track in Calgary was, I think, in September, and then by February we were at Pyeongchang at the Olympics.
Wow.
I was fortunate to sort of pick up the sport very quickly, just because in my nature I'm tall and I was very strong at the time, and that's what you need to be for a bobsledder. And I was a long jumper, so good sort of hand-eye coordination and spatial awareness. So every time I jumped into the sled, I actually landed in the sled, which wasn't the case for some new people when they went down. And I did a year of bobsledding, did that whole tour, and it was fun. And that was it. Then I retired from sport fully and focused on my profession. And I started a side project, which maybe we'll get to later. But that's essentially my sport background. And like I said, I went to Loughborough. I used to live in my family growing up traveled a lot. They worked for the UN and other NGOs in the international development space. So I was born in Nigeria, but we lived in Senegal, Canada, Italy. And as you know, I went to school in the UK. So that's how I ended up in Loughborough at the time.
Amazing. Citizen of the world, and incredible as well. I think you're one of the very few examples of athletes who've gone from a summer sport, if you like, to a winter sport in terms of the games. It's very special, I think, and obviously incredible to have that success in 2 different disciplines as well. So it's clearly, as you can hear yourself talking, clearly incredibly ambitious, versatile, lots going on in terms of what you're doing. So your educational background was around sort of sustainability, renewables, etc. So tell us tell us a little bit about that, but also how you brought these 2 things together in terms of your success in your work in sport, and then on the sustainability side as well.
Yeah, and I tell the story to pretty much anyone who asks. The reason why I got into engineering is the same reason that I sort of shifted recently focusing in the sustainability and sport world, and it's because of Star Trek, the
Nice.
television program. Yeah, and not the original, not the original from William Shatner, but the more recent stuff from the '90s
Yeah.
onwards. And the reason for that is, when I was young, I'd come home and I'd sort of lose myself in the world of Star Trek every weekday from 6 till 7. And in this world, they created it was a utopia,
Yeah.
but in the sense that humanity was at its peak. We weren't fighting amongst ourselves for land or resources. We'd figured out how to convert energy into different forms, and we were sort of focusing our efforts on what I thought was important, exploring the universe and just trying to be our best selves. And I wanted to be in that kind of world because it seems so petty what we were focusing on in our world. So, how can I get there? And it was through engineering. Star Trek is one of those shows that is really heavy on science and problem solving, critical thinking. So it inspired me to go into engineering because I wanted to be on that spaceship one day, but also into renewable energy technology, because to get to that world, we have to sort of move beyond the traditional way of sort of converting energy or converting resources into energy. And that's why it's I find myself in sport and sustainability now, because I love sport, as you've seen in my background, and environmentalism is very, very important to me because I want us to get to that state. So it's a perfect mixture of the two.
Yeah, incredible, and incredible as well in terms of a lot of maybe athletes speaking out in this space, or people who are really important spokespeople for the industry. A lot of them haven't got the educational background in terms of the background that you have. So again, I think it to the movement overall, where there's voices like yours that have got that sport background, but also the learnings and the education around actually what we need to do from a technical side to transition, etc. It's a very special combination, I think, as well.
True. But don't get me wrong, I have forgotten a lot of what I learned.
You've forgotten more than you remember.
Yeah. I used to pride myself in, as exam season came up, I teach myself a year's worth of content in about a week because I spent so much time traveling. But that being said, I know a lot of athletes are concerned about speaking up because they're worried about coming off as either hypocrites, or because they travel so much, or just sort of being disingenuous because they don't really know, or they think they don't know what they're talking about. And that's a fair concern. And I have that concern too. That's my biggest fear, someone calling me out and saying, actually, Shay, carbon neutrality is X, Y, and Z, not A, B, and C. But the fact of the matter is, I think we all have to go through the same process. If you're passionate about this, like I have podcasts, your podcast, Matt Campelli's podcast. There's books out there. I'm slowly, getting a library of sustainability books. It's just I think if people took the time slowly and incrementally just to sort of read and talk and educate themselves, they'll quickly find themselves in a position to feel comfortable talking and making the impact they want to. Anyone can do it. You don't have to be an engineer.
No, absolutely. And I think that's a really important point, because we were at the BASIS annual summit up in Wales this week, the British Association for Sustainable Sport, and we were on a panel talking about storytelling. And obviously storytelling comes up a lot in terms of the athlete voice in this space, for sure. And some of the conversation around hypocrisy was that a lot of it comes from intention, in terms of if you are being transparent with your journey and what you know and what you think and where that's come from, then actually someone might call you a hypocrite, but we're all hypocrites in terms of the world we live in, and the actions we're trying to take, because none of us live a carbon neutral lifestyle, but that doesn't mean we don't care deeply and we're trying to be better and make changes. So I think you're absolutely right in terms of that. But I think the background in terms of there's also no doubt that where people have got that background and that education and learning, that it helps. But to your point, we can all continually educate ourselves around this. So tell us as well how you're activating around the sustainability side. I know you're part of Eco Athletes, you've got Racing to Zero, etc. I'd love to hear a little bit more around the roles you're taking to be a voice in this space or drive change.
Yeah, I try and be really thoughtful with how I spend my time in this space, because I kind of categorize what is possible out there into sort of, categories. The first one is the advocacy bit. The assumption here is, yes, we should all do our bit, but there has to be institutional change, government change, et cetera, et cetera. And to sort of push that, we need a groundswell of people to sort of speak and influence those in power. And that's where the advocacy comes in, which is why, whether it's Eco Athletes or Protect Our Winters, all these sport groups, I really like being a part of them, joining their meetings, going to the webinars, and sharing the information I get from these events with other athletes, or inviting athletes to join those groups, because it's just a way for us to sort of educate ourselves and then make a change. In Canada, I'm on a committee, a federal government committee on essentially greening sport, because I was approached a couple of years ago by Eco Athletes, because they found me tweeting something that was about sport, and they said, "Hey, come join our group. Yeah. Share what you know, learn from others." I said, "Yeah, sure." And things snowballed. And because of that history of advocacy, I was approached by our government to be on that committee, which is great. Very proud to do it. And that's me making an impact on that front. But because of my engineering background, I'm very, very keen on not just speaking about things and drawing attention to it, but actually making a tangible impact in my own community, which is why I sort of created this not-for-profit called Racing to Zero with 4 other Olympians back in 2019. And the cliff notes of this is, the aim is for the 5 of us to help grassroots sporting organizations in Canada, so your local clubs, your provincial sport organizations, and then also the national sport organizations, help them do their bit. We want the sports sector to be like aviation, who's trying to find technology to be, carbon neutral by X whatever year, or, farming, or, every sector, mining, every sector says, we're going to do something. And we just find that, at our level, at the grassroots level, there just isn't the capacity, the knowledge, the money to do anything like there is at the IOC level. Yeah. So we said, okay, let's make an impact and help them. We have our expertise, we have our connections. We're gonna help you measure your emissions. We're gonna help you reduce your waste. We're gonna help you market what you've done to other people to bring more money in, and we're gonna do it at a cost that's super, super cheap. That the big 4 couldn't do it without significant losses. That's the two avenues: advocacy and then some measurable change.
And what was the catalyst for creating this not-for-profit in terms of driving this? Was there something that happened to you that thought, I can fix this, I can get involved? Or what was the nugget of something that drove you to create that NGO?
Yeah. It was an event I was in Olympia in Greece. They have this every year. The International Olympic Academy has this conference where they invite young people who are in the sport community to sort of come and talk about sport and play games, because it's like a summer camp, but also just network. And the IOC came to that event and said, "Hey, we have this program called the IOC Young Leaders, where we give money to people in the sporting community who are passionate about something. And that passion project is in line with Olympic ideals as well as the UN Sustainable Development Goals." So we said, think on it. If you have an idea, send us your pitch and we'll give you 5,000 Swiss francs. It was nothing, like no real material amount. So on the flight back home, I said, "Oh, wow, this is, I've always wanted to do something, but I either didn't have the time or the money or the capacity, but now I'm more or less retired. Let's do something." So I took their money and I said, I'm gonna merge all my passions, and Racing to Zero sort of was built. At first, it was just, I'm gonna help this one club recycle their plastic bottles, because that's always the gateway drug. Listening to your podcast and Matt's, I thought I was unique. There are so many people who have the exact same thing. I'm gonna create a company to help people recycle their plastic bottles. And by the time I got, halfway through Maddie Orr's, her podcast, her first 2 seasons, I was like, man, I am late to the party. But
well, we need everyone, man, and everyone brings something. So
yeah. But it evolved. I went from plastic to scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, and I had another Olympian who was a researcher in this space join us, which was great, because now our calculations are in line with the greenhouse gas protocol, so it's sort of grounded in something defendable. Yeah. And we're learning and expanding our offerings more and more.
Amazing. Yeah, absolutely. And what's the, what would you love that to be in terms of, is it just, driving incremental change, or have you got a vision of where you want this to be and what you want to achieve with it?
Yeah, well, like I say, it's a not-for-profit. So I'm not planning on selling it and retiring as a multi-billionaire. But ideally, what I would like it to be is for us to sort of grow in our team and our knowledge and capacity, and be essentially the tool of choice, because there's not really that many people in this space anyway, the tool of choice for these sporting organizations in Canada, and maybe even expanding to the US, universities as well, to just say, okay, we want to do our part. Let's go to Racing to Zero, and they'll help us understand our baseline. They'll give us tips, because athletes can't stop traveling. So because we're all athletes, we can say, okay, here are some options, that aren't going to jeopardize your operations and athletes' perspective, athletes' potential, but still make your impact. So that's the end goal. We are just a partner in getting to carbon neutrality in the sport community. And on top of that, I also want us to have this sort of research element, in that we can say for sure the Olympic amateur sport produces this amount of emissions or travels this many kilometers. Because I checked the databases. No one, it's difficult, because are we going to be grouped with aviation, or are we going to be grouped with some other sector? We're a mixture of sectors, but no one is doing that research on sport, and not professional sport, but Olympic amateur sport. Yeah. And that's a big gap. So filling that gap is also a long-term goal for us.
Well, we would love that if you did that, because I have, this conversation time and again, and this dearth of data in certain areas, and again, I was interviewed recently when we launched a recent Sport Positive Leagues, where someone said, what's the carbon footprint of football globally? And it's like, where do you start? Even we haven't got that information at a professional level. We need the only people who can collate that data are FIFA or UEFA, FIFA really, in terms of global professional sport, in terms of asking every professional club in every country to give a baseline report, and then we'd have a starting point. But then grassroots, how would you ever get that?
They even do that? Yeah.
It's so vast. But also, I think, the same as the climate challenge, we can't let the difficulty or the vastness of the challenge put us off. But to your point, if you can collate a reasonable amount of data in grassroots in your state in Canada, that's a start, and then if you can build out, or other organizations can do that. Because I think part of the reason, and I'm coming on to ask you about the challenges, but I'm tabling one to start off with. Part of I think the challenge with getting people to take this seriously is they don't understand the severity of what we're facing, and there isn't any information out there to share the data and statistics and research and figures on the impact actually that we're having, and why we've got a responsibility to reduce that in terms of the overall thing. So I think that is definitely a challenge from my side, that the lack of data and research and information for us to point to and say, this is where we are, this is where we need to be, this is the challenge, etc. But building on that, I'd love to hear from you in terms of your sort of unique position within this. From your perspective, what are the challenges you think we're facing, the barriers to do more, the barriers for sport to take more of a role in terms of the climate crisis, or tackling environmental sustainability?
Yeah, definitely can answer that. But the last thing you mentioned made me also think of something else I'm aiming for in the previous question. Because your league tables on your website, really, really cool. And creating something like that, but rather than from club to club, from sport to sport, being able to say that the Alpine team in Canada, which travels to Chile and the Alps, this is the typical footprint of an athlete compared to an Olympic athlete who's a wrestler who goes from arena to arena. Because that has an impact on, I think it has an impact on the new athletes coming up. Because the younger generation, the Gen X, or is it Gen Z, I don't know any. The literature is saying that they find this very, very important. Yes. And it may seem sort of minor, but if it's so important, it also may dictate which sports they engage in. And we know that grassroots sports are sort of trying to survive, because some sports don't have that many athletes coming in. So what you have on your website in like a measurable way would be huge, sort of as an impetus for those sports to change, because this is your survivability now that comes into question.
It's so important. And I think that makes me think about, I remember Dan Murphy from ESPN did quite a substantial piece around the Winter Games last year, this year at Tokyo, where obviously everyone was talking about the amount of artificial snow, etc. And he and a colleague, I think it was Alyssa, someone did a longer thought leadership sort of piece around the Winter Games. And as part of that, to your exact point, they interviewed snowboarders and skiers who are at the peak of their professional career, and they're saying, we now, with the lack of snow in the areas that we're having to fly around the world to be able to train to find the snow. So how can someone at a grassroots level who hasn't, and they're still having to make films and documentaries and fundraise to get the money to be able to do that, how can someone who's coming into the sport possibly get access to that? And therefore they're losing talent. So to exactly the point you're making there, understanding that a little bit more deeply might make people think, well, actually, I'm going to go into skateboarding instead, or I'm going to go into BMX or something, because snow sports are going to be unachievable for me, but I've got a greater chance of success in this. So we have to think about that, and it's horrible for the sports, but also I guess where we are is starting to try and help younger people think more practically about where their sports are going to be in 50 years' time.
Yeah. Amen. Totally agree.
A lot there. So tell me about, challenges, barriers. What do you think?
Yeah. So like I mentioned, this started off as an IOC funded project and my own National Olympic Committee, COC, Canadian Olympic Committee funded project. And it's since evolved into like an actual business, a social enterprise. So this year, because of its evolution into an actual business, I wanted to interview as many clients to really understand what their barriers and their pain points were, because any good business has to understand what the client's issues are to sort of provide a good solution. So I spoke to, we'll say 60% of all the Olympic sports in the country at the CEO level. I'm lucky because I was an Olympian and I was also on the board of directors for our Olympic committee. So I know a lot of these people already, and it was very easy for us to sort of start these conversations. It wouldn't be for anybody. But in these interviews, I asked the same questions over and over again. And four big barriers came out, and I have to try and remember it now. The first and easy one is money. Some of these sports, they don't even have employees. Like they're all volunteer, because in Canada, the majority, their operations are funded by the government, federal government, which is tax revenue, and that's not going to increase every year. So that's number one. Number two was the capacity. Even if they have the money, the employees or the volunteers within their company, within their organizations, they are focused on safeguarding athletes because of history lately. They're focused on getting grassroots sports because they want their sport to survive. They're focused on high performance sports because their money is contingent on medals at the games. These are like existential priorities for these organizations. They don't have the people to sort of add on environmental sustainability onto their plate when there's already other stuff. And that sort of overlaps with the third barrier, in that, is this a priority anyway? They said to me, Shay, we are paid for medals. We are paid to protect athletes. We are paid to ensure diversity in our sports and ensure that it's open to every Canadian in the country. We're not paid to make the sport environmentally sustainable. And that's just a fact. Even though it's important, it just really isn't a priority. And then the fourth one, I just remembered now, is just awareness. Some folks, I think one of the questions I asked was, what's environmental programs or actions have you taken in the past, or are you taking now? And aside from, we're digital now, we don't use paper, or, we try and minimize our bottles. Most folks say we don't really know the first thing to do. We don't know the difference between scope 1 and scope 3. We don't know what formula or what carbon emission factors to use. We just don't know the first thing to do. And that's a big barrier, because it's just not common knowledge. I learn new things every day. So those are four large barriers that, if overcome, it would be a lot easier to make the tangible changes that we spent the last half hour talking about.
Absolutely. And I think none of them are vastly surprising in terms of the things that have come up there. I think the big one in terms of the money and the capacity, I think it's not an easy fix, but there's something there. I think the around and the awareness as well. We're obviously constantly trying to change that, but to me, it's the priority one in terms of, as you said, there is mandates from certain areas for them to be funded to do certain things. And environmental sustainability isn't part of that, which feeds into the work you're doing at a government level in terms of needing to drive policy on this. How far do you think, in terms of, say that just in the context of the work you're doing, not globally, you're not a spokesperson for governments everywhere, but in terms of the conversations you've had in the context in which we talk, how far do you think the government, either local, federal, state level, etc., prioritizing this and adding that in to that would make a big change across possibly all four of those barriers?
Massive. The best, I interviewed the Quebec provincial, that's our region, provincial cycling federation, and they were the best out of all the people I interviewed. They have a green sport charter. They have their clubs and their event managers thinking about these things and requiring it. And I asked them, what makes you so special, other than you're the French-speaking province in the country? And they say that it's because our provincial government has prioritized this. Quebec, out of all our 10 provinces and 3 territories, that's very important in that part of the country. So they're giving money to these organizations, and they're giving the green light and the support to sort of create these programs. So at the federal government level, and speaking to the leaders, they're aware of the problem, and they have the drive. But it's just difficult because there's a limited number of funds, especially coming off the pandemic. And they don't have the data. Like everything in government, you need to have the backing to make a decision, or else your taxpayers are going to go, or they're always going to go crazy. So I think there's a concern that if we make the sweeping statement without anything to back it up, then we're going to be sewered by the press and by the people. So it'll take time to gather the data to support whatever policy decisions we think would be beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see this again, I think in different parts of the world, it's very interesting. So, and this isn't something we've really covered that much on the podcast, but in France, for example, a country-wide policy level, whilst in some ways other countries are further ahead, France is really the only country that has policy in place that says if you host a mega sports event in our country, these are the 15 points that you have to achieve. And no, they're not all environmental sustainability. There's diversity, there's accessibility, there's other sustainability, but a good chunk of those are around the environmental impact that you have and making sure that's reduced. The same in Scotland at COP26 last year. They've said we are going to be investing in environmental sustainability in sport, and they've brought together groups, of federations, governing bodies within sport in Scotland to help drive that forward. And I think these examples, I think we all need to look at more, and a lot of governments need to take notice of this, because so many governments have got nationally determined contributions in terms of their commitments to climate change, but very, very few have connected them to sport. And if Canada, the UK, wherever, if they've got any chance of trying to get to these carbon emission reductions, sport is a massive, massive way in which they can reach their communities and drive this change, actually in a place where people already are, in a way that they can engage them a lot. And I think that raises a brilliant point with what you've mentioned in terms of that particular province in Canada, where they've seen that success because the government's prioritized it.
Yeah, and I would also add that the IOC, not a government agent, but they have a similar kind of power to sort of mandate these requirements. Like the games have to be carbon positive by, I think, 2030 onward.
Yeah.
And the IOC they're not at the level of mandating it, but there are soft requirements for international federations to sort of start thinking about these things for their world championships. And the few international federations that take it very seriously, like the canoeing federation, ICF, it's trickling down because the National Sport Federation in Canada, the Canoe Kayak Federation, it's top of mind for them, not just because they're outside and impacted, but because their IF is sort of pushing things down. So for sure, policy, whether government or in our case at the IOC level, it has a huge impact. I forgot to mention at the start, I'm on the IOC Sustainability and Legacy Commission. So I see what they're doing, and I see the drive they have. The difficulty, like everything, is they can't force IF to do everything. Yeah. And the IFs themselves, some don't have the capacity or the money to do it.
Absolutely. And this is it again, I think wherever the impacts lie, whether it's policy, whether it's awareness, whether it's the capacity, unfortunately, it always comes back to money. If people have that financing and that funding, and the people who are either donating or granting or funding that, then you can increase capacity, you can increase awareness, you can make it a priority because the money's there to do it. This is a big question, Seyi. So, I mean, I haven't got the answer to this, so let's see if you do. But where do you think, in terms of mobilizing more of this money, is there a way you think that's on your mind that we could work harder to mobilize some of this money to make it worth brands, organizations, money, to try and find more money to drive this work? Have you thought about that? Or have you got any thoughts on that?
I have a lot, and this is why I join webinars and I don't go to conferences, but I wish I could.
Yeah,
I just try and find information everywhere because I'm hoping that there is some startup somewhere. Because I think there has to be a technological solution. Yeah. I'm hoping that there's someone that is aware of like the climate financing, but relevant to sport. Because we know there's either individual donors, wealthy individuals. We know there's corporations who aren't in sport but are passionate about the environment, who would put money in sport, who sponsor sport. Yeah. The issue isn't creating money. There's money out there. It's finding the money in the different areas and then bringing it together. And I don't know anything about the mining sector, but maybe there's a company out there who's run by, a CEO who loves cycling and would love to put 3 million into the cycling, but they just don't know about it. It's bringing all that together. And it's got to be technological, because I don't think one person knows everything.
No. Absolutely. And I think brands as well, again, one of the things we're talking about a lot now is, sponsors of major sporting event and the money that goes into that in terms of branding and visibility and driving awareness or connecting with new consumers, or, whether it's business intelligence or business development, etc. Part of the stuff I'm trying to find out, and I know others in the industry is like how much of that money is it's going into perhaps a club or a league or an organization. How much of that is about positive activations, and could any of that be funneled into the grassroots of that sport? Could it be funneled into the climate action that's happening within that sport? And we know sport is vast, it's global, everyone has lots of different agendas and lots of different goals, but the brands have got the corporate organizations that sponsor sport are really the ones who've probably got the money to do this. But how do we get them engaged to the point that they can see beyond the direct ROI of sponsoring a sporting event and into the overall progress of that sport in terms of its environmental awareness? And I mean, maybe someone listening to this podcast has the answer to that and they can let us know, but I haven't got there yet in terms of, and maybe it's just case by case, individual to individual, but we certainly haven't uncovered yet where that comes from.
That's a really, really good point. It's more than just finding money, but also finding, proving the value that the money can bring back once it's invested. This is a great research, idea for like a PhD. Yeah. We'll get Maddie or to one of the students.
One of the students.
Like a sensitivity analysis. Like if you were to categorize the avenues that the investment would go into, whether it's advocacy or like technology or just emissions calculations, some kind of sensitivity analysis to say $1 here at grassroots results in this, $1 to advocacy results in policy change, or $1 to technology results in emissions reductions. Yeah. It seems like a pretty big ask, but that would help certainly sort of justify the money coming in the sport world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the more conversations I have, the more I realize that actually all of us, even people who have got sign off on pots of money that go in certain directions for different reasons, there's usually a very slim silo about where that money's going and what they want to achieve. And as you said, there's some philanthropic funding or grants, etc., that maybe think more widely, but most of that corporate money is about achieving a certain goal, which was not really what we're looking for with this, because climate change and climate activation at a grassroots level of sport all the way up, then we'd love to find that, as you said, sensitivity analysis that proves that. But even, the best communications campaigns in the world, in terms of reaching wide audiences, etc., often it's very difficult to prove ROI in terms of this person saw your brand this many times and then made this action. There is a lot of there's a lot of weak points of that, and then with broader societal change, there's even more. It's a lot.
So then the question is, do we spend our effort trying to find ways to quantify the ROI on an green sport, or do we find ways trying to convince the donors that they should change what they view, how they measure the value of the money? Because you can't do both. No. So which one do you think is more likely to be successful? It's a question for you.
Yeah, that's a big question as well, isn't it? I think having had the conversation, quite a few conversations in this area, I think changing minds in terms of where the money is spent and how it's activated, it feels closer in terms of you can talk to the decision makers to try and change the hearts and minds, but it also feels further away in the sense of they're not necessarily at the top of that conversation. They're given a pot of money to distribute in this way. So whilst they might buy in individually, can they change the organization to buy in? But then typically different challenges with the other in terms of not proving the ROI, but trying to drive wider changes, where the entry points to that, and how we make that change. And I think, again, the older I get and the more I work in this area, the more I realize that actually huge amount of incredibly big changes are driven by one particularly passionate individual. If you look at Unilever and what they've done, really that was because Paul Polman was very, very focused on sustainability. So the one person, yes, he happened to be the chairman and CEO, brilliant. You look at Forest Green Rovers and Dale Vince, there's one person who sits at the center of it that drives this cascading change. And I think as much as we need to drive systematic change, I think as well, as much as it's not the ideal thing, I think it's about finding the right people within inside those organizations who are decision makers, and they already know how important this is. But then that makes it so difficult to replicate or to scale, because you're just looking for those individuals rather than a methodology to be able to approach lots of organizations about this.
So going back to what you said at the start of the podcast, I guess it's a good thing that I'm the last of the party here, because we need a lot of people in this party, because there's so many different angles to hit up. Yeah. So it's sort of a full court press to get the results we want. Yeah.
We'll try and solve everything, Shay, but it's slowly. And I think that's it. I think it is going to take all of us and a lot of people and a continued number of people driving this in so many different angles and at so many different levels. And I think that's why at the minute, so we, for example, are working with a lot of clubs, leagues, governing bodies, federations, athletes, etc. You're really carving out more around the athletes and the grassroots. We've got a lot of colleagues who are on the academia side. We need to build into more brands. We need to build into agencies. We need to build into the performance side of sports as well as the business side, etc. And I think sport, as well as we've spoken about so frequently, is not simple in terms of decision makers and makeup in terms of how this happens. So I think that's why it's going to take us all from so many different stakeholder groups within the industry to drive this. So big challenges ahead, but a lot of big brains working on it. So I think, hopeful. But tell me about what your hope for the future is in terms of your work, but also for sport and its role within tackling the climate crisis.
Well, my hope for my work is that we're successful in what we're doing. There's a lot of different stakeholders, like you mentioned, working in different areas, and I don't know. In these podcasts I listen to, I hear somebody say, "Oh, yeah, I created this." I don't know if they're still around a year or 2 years later, and I'm sure many aren't, just because it's a difficult thing. And the five of us were finding it difficult just to sort of get the results we want from a business perspective, and sort of stay alive. So what I'm hoping for is, this is important. We have a good sort of business plan. I want us to make an impact and grow and be successful, so we can help the entire world be successful. What was the second part of the question you asked?
Just like your wider hope for sustain, in terms of within the role that you can play at your level, at a granular level, in terms of the work you're doing in 10 years time, where would you love, sport to be in terms of tackling the climate crisis, or as you mentioned, maybe overcoming some of those barriers?
Yeah, in 10 years, I'd love us to have the answers to everything we talked about in terms of data, know what the sports sector's impact is, know what a sport versus another sport's impact is. That would be great. And just have a critical mass of knowledge on this area. You talk to anybody in the track world, and anybody will tell you the value of lifting weights for a sprinter. Anybody will tell you the value of of a good, healthy diet for any athlete. I want us to be able to say 10 years down the line, anybody in the sport, in the track will tell you, oh yeah, this is the most effective way to keep your carbon footprint low for travel. Use this tech, or use this airline, or design your travel in this kind of way. I want it to be sort of just ingrained in the culture of the sport, from top to bottom, left to right, whether it's the coaches, therapists, athletes, volunteers. Everybody knows that would be the goal.
Amazing. Well, listen, you're incredible. Keep doing what you're doing, and we're really excited to see the evolution of Racing to Zero and your work more broadly. And thank you for taking the time to come on the podcast today as well.
Yeah, thanks for the invite. It was a really great chat. I love talking shop, and I love learning stuff. I learned a lot with you in this last hour.
Amazing. Thanks so much. And that was Seyi Smith, 2 times Olympian and founder of Racing to Zero, on the Climate of Sport podcast. See you next time. Thanks for listening to the Climate of Sport podcast. Please like and subscribe, and get in touch if you want to share information about the work that you're doing, if you want to appear as a guest, or you want to recommend guests, or you just have ideas of conversations you'd like us to have. You can get in touch by emailing info@sportpositivesummit.com.